All right. Well, we are at noon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for being with us this Thursday. APA Virginia, my name is Jillian Saul, and I am staff for APA Virginia, and the chapter is happy to support the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaborations webinar series. We have maybe a familiar face to some of our attendees. Julia Friedgood with the American Farmland Trust presented somewhat recently in our APA Virginia's chapter webinar series, Your Hour with APA Virginia. So we're happy to have her back, this time with the Mid-Atlantic. Today, Julia will be presenting Small Farm Survival, Planning for Sustainable and Resilient Food Systems. Um, I'm going to run through a couple of quick logistical items before I hand it over. So first things first, you'll see the CM number listed here on this slide deck. I will also post that in the chat once I hand things over to Julia. Um, Other things I'll post in the chat will include the link to our YouTube page where you can find all previously recorded webinars in the series. You probably got a notification on your screen just a moment ago that this webinar is being recorded. Um, Let me advance my deck here. We really do encourage questions. If you could submit your questions through the Q&A box, that will just help me keep track of all inquiries. I'll keep the chat box open as well if there's ever an opportunity for any open-ended discussion. And then feel free to ask those questions, put those questions in the Q&A as we go. But once we get to the formal Q&A period at the end, if you'd prefer to ask your question out loud, you are welcome to use the raise hand feature, and I would take you off mute and you could ask your question that way. I will also put in the chat, in addition to the YouTube link and the CM link, I'll also post the link to the MAPC website page where you can stay up to date with the webinar series and other things happening within the collaboration. I think that about covers it for logistics. Feel free to DM me if you have any questions as we go. All the slide decks, I'll just say in advance, I'll say it again at the end, all the slide decks will be shared with attendees. Um, Alrighty, well, let me go ahead and hand it over to Julia, but thank you everyone for being with us.
Thanks, Jillian. And let me bring up my slides. Can everybody see them? Everything okay?
Yep, looks great.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's really nice to be here. If you were on for the Virginia presentation, this one's going to be a little different. That one was very sort of grounded in practical reality in Virginia. This one's maybe a little bit higher level, and it's kind of a call to action for planners, because I think we're at an important inflection point. A lot of what I have to say may sound discouraging, but we can't give up hope. And if we care about small farms and access to healthy and sustainable food, we have to really think about them in all of our planning processes. So it could be a standalone food systems plan, and I'll talk a little bit about what I think food systems planning is all about, or a plan for agriculture, which I think is a really critical element in a food system plan. But it really also can be just integrating food and farming issues into our regular planning activities, whether those are comp plans or sustainability plans or climate action plans or emergency management plans. Like, planners do a lot of different kinds of planning, and I think it's really important to think about food and agriculture as part of all of those planning activities. Okay, so if you're not familiar with American Farmland Trust, we've been around since 1980. We're a nonprofit organization, and we're dedicated to saving the land that sustains us. Most people know us for our work protecting farmland, but we also promote sound farming practices and keeping farmers on the land. If you're not familiar with us, you may be familiar with our bumper sticker and our No Farms, No Food campaign. Um, and I've been with AFT for about, I don't know, 35 years, a long time, working kind of across our mission areas, but with a real passion, a background in, and a real passion for planning. So today I'm going to talk about food systems and both the threats to and the importance of small farms, especially to local and regional food systems and to communities. When I talk about food systems, I really mean kind of multi-dimensional social, ecological systems. I know that's a lot of words, um, but it's really important to think of them as an integrated system and not standalone components or parts. In the Mid-Atlantic, as elsewhere in the US, we benefit from a myriad of intersecting food systems. It's not just one monolithic food system. And they're nested together like matryoshka dolls with different scopes and scales to meet a variety of needs. And that's from emergency food systems to global supply chains with community, local, regional, domestic food systems all sort of nestled in between. And the systems, I come from an ag perspective, so I think of the production of food as being integral to the food system. And that relies on natural resources like arable land and affordable land, clean water, sunshine, various microclimates to produce diverse crops and livestock. And all of this is supported by the management and labor of farmers and farm workers and a vast assortment of intermediaries along the supply chain, from aggregating and processing to distributing, all the way to buying and consuming food. And all these things are influenced by many things, partially our own human behavior and dietary preferences, but also public policies at all levels of government, and market forces impacts affecting one part of the system affect the rest, along with the price of food. So lots of people have created graphics. This is the one that I've been using, which I think tries to get the idea that it's all kind of integrated together. And when I talk about sustainable and resilient food systems, I really mean that they embody the whole life cycle of food. They build on the principles of sustainable agriculture, giving equal attention to economic, environmental, and equity concerns throughout the supply chain, all the way through the disposal of food and farm waste. They're resilient when they can respond, adapt, recover, and prepare for disruptions, shocks, and traumatic events like a pandemic, severe flooding, a wildfire, market disruptions, and so on. I think that COVID was a wake-up call. And I think that there's sort of ripple effects still in play that make people remember that our kind of the domestic and global food systems we tend to rely on are fairly fragile and brittle. So I see COVID as sort of the canary in a coal mine, exposing vulnerabilities, but not creating them. And when the pandemic hit, consumers were shocked when they found empty shelves at supermarkets. There were no eggs for Easter. They were appalled when temporary closures of a couple of meatpacking plants caused shortages, while livestock producers were left without processing alternatives, and many had to euthanize their animals. But this is what happens when four multinational companies control 85% of the purchasing and processing of American beef and 70% of pork. So the food system, the sort of supporting system, has become very, very concentrated. Rising food prices combined with high unemployment increased hunger, especially among children. And while failing to protect the health and safety of their workers, these large meatpacking companies earned record profits. And they're not alone. This kind of concentration is happening across our dominant food systems. Since COVID, food price inflation has persisted. It was something that the president campaigned on, promised to solve. So far, it hasn't been solved. The administration's response seems to be to relax protections against dangerous chemical inputs, to allow cruelty to labor and livestock. And now the war in Iran is increasing inflation, especially in food and fuel prices, and has had a crushing effect on agriculture, especially on small family farms. And then, of course, there's climate change, which is its own crisis. I'm not going to go into that, but it disrupts all parts of the food system. Extreme weather, rising temperatures, shifting rainfall patterns destroy crops, diminish nutritional quality, break down supply chains. disproportionately impacting vulnerable low-income communities. So all these combined impacts, economic instability, geopolitical conflict, climate change, pandemics, all of these amplify each other, resulting in what's being called a polycrisis that's even more severe than the sum of the individual effects. But my message today is that we can turn this around. Well, before I get to the more positive message, I have to say it's not going to be easy. People in my world, so sort of the ag and conservation worlds, are talking about a generational downturn in agriculture. Costs are up, income is down, land values are higher than they've ever been before. Ag is becoming increasingly consolidated, supported by government payments that favor a small minority of large farms over the majority of all farms. And before I sort of get into sort of talking about small farms and scale and so on, I thought it would be good to share some basic definitions. This slide shows the USDA's farm typology based on financial scale. So it comes from their Economic Research Service. GCFI, it means gross cash farm income. 86% of farms are small family farms, which means their GCFI is less than $350,000 a year. ERS has categorized them in several ways, but I'm not going to really unpack that. Mid-sized farms are the next level up. They're between $350K and $1 million of GCFI. They're really being squeezed out and now only represent about 6% of all farms. Large farms and very large farms are the sectors that are growing, and they're growing fast. Large farms are 1 million or more of GCFI. Very large farms are 5 million or more. And together they represent less than 5% of all farms, but about half the value of production. And then when I talk about family farms, that means they're majority owned by primary operator and their relative. And non-family farms include corporate run or operations, but not family corporations like independent corporations, partnerships of unrelated individuals, or farms managed by a hired manager without ownership stakes. And just sort of for context, family farms still account for 95% of all US farms. They operate about 84% of land and farms, but the non-family farm sector is rapidly expanding, especially among the largest of the scale farms. Okay, so with that sort of as background and whatever, there's a little context and conditions. I said, what we found during COVID wasn't caused by COVID. It's been a long period that's gotten us to where we are, and it wasn't by accident. So I think it's important to sort of understand that trajectory. So generations of food policy have sort of promoted this idea of cheap food and policies to get big or get out. That started really in the second half of the last century. The mantra was this sort of get big or get out mantra was most famously expressed by President Nixon's ag secretary, a guy named Earl Butz. They encourage specialization and productivity and consolidation in food and ag systems, which has increased concentration throughout the food supply chain. Since systems solutions are multidimensional and complex, transforming them from a focus on productivity and efficiency to one that still is productive and efficient, but that values sustainability and resilience isn't going to be solved sector by sector. Yet most of our food policy is piecemeal, driven by the omnibus federal farm bill, which addresses the different parts of the system largely without connecting the whole. The Farm Bill is renewed by Congress every 5 years. It probably should be called a food bill because it primarily supports nutrition programs. About 75% of the funding goes to nutrition programs. And it sets national nutrition, ag, conservation, and forestry policy. After nutrition, farm commodity payments, crop insurance, and conservation are kind of the largest things that it funds. but less than 1% funds things that kind of connect small farms and sustainable food systems and sustainable agriculture. They're still important, even though they're a real minority of what the bill does. In recent years, Congress has been unable to pass a new farm bill, even though historically it was a bipartisan piece of legislation. So we're still operating under the 2018 legislation, which should have expired 3 years ago in 2023. It's been extended multiple times, currently to the end of September. In March, the House passed its version of a 2026 farm bill, and locked in an historic $187 billion reduction in the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly food stamps. I hope that that will change when it goes through the Senate process, and the Senate now has it to negotiate a more bipartisan version. But that's a huge cut to food assistance programs. But sort of overall, historically, this drive towards specialization and productivity and efficiency did achieve the goal of increasing production and distribution efficiencies and produced a plentiful and relatively cheap food supply. And it successfully expanded global markets and Americans' food choices. We can pretty much eat pretty much anything all year round. So these huge gains in productivity were achieved through technology and especially the use of fossil fuels. Total domestic output tripled between 1948 and 2019, and combined with liberalized global trade, increased food availability at lower costs. Just sort of for reference, in 1972, Americans spent about 16% of their disposable personal income on food. About 12.5% on food at home, their groceries, about 3% away from home. Last year, on average, most consumers only spend about 10% of their income on food and only about 5% on food at home. The increase has been, largely in food away from home. And that was even with the inflationary uptick, more eating out, eating a lot more than we used to. There was a Pew Research study that found we eat about 23% more now than we did in the 1970s. You can see that in my belly. Due to the war in Iran, this year the percent likely will be higher, although it may be hard to find out because USDA has stopped collecting the data. In spite of all of this and huge efforts to lower the cost of food and make it widely available to everybody, we still have a food insecurity problem. Last year, or I guess in 2024, about 14% of US households were food insecure at least sometime during the year. 5% experienced very low food security. It's disproportionately affecting Black, Hispanic, and rural households. It's worse for children. You can see in the chart that over 18% of households with children experienced food insecurity in 2024. I would expect an uptick this year, given, all these inflationary pressures. But again, we may not have the data because USDA stopped conducting the household food security reports, calling them redundant, costly, politicized, and extraneous studies that do nothing more than fearmonger. At the same time as, we had these sort of changes in the availability and affordability of food, we really changed the way agriculture was practiced in this country, and we separated crop production from livestock production. So up until then, most farmers were diversified. They grew multiple crops. They raised different kinds of livestock. Today, most focus on 2, maybe 3. Poultry and livestock producers increasingly rely on purchased feed instead of growing their own. Crop producers rely on synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. All of this increases costs to ag productions, degrades the environment, and can harm human health. And sort of another sideline of this is as agriculture has become more consolidated, There's been this hollowing out of a lot of rural communities with shrinking populations, declining institutions like hospitals and banks, and per capita, the highest rates of food insecurity in the country, which maybe seems ironic, but it is really because of the way we've rejiggered the system. So as you know, all of this productivity, right, really increased farm output. Farms have gotten larger and larger, and in the process, farm numbers fell. Especially, the policy drove this consolidation, which I keep mentioning, but I think it's really important, by directing most subsidies like crop insurance and commodity payments to the largest operations, reducing their financial risk while increasing their capacity for expansion, generally at the expense of small and mid-sized farms, which often don't qualify for those programs or get so little money from them, it's not worth it to go through the red tape. The decline was so dramatic, USDA described it as a free fall situation leading to trauma. You can see in that blue line on the chart, right, that really steep decline in the number of farms. That really tells the story, and you can also see, in the line going up, that's the sign towards consolidation. And then, land and farms has declined, but not nearly as dramatically. And the trends are continuing, just not as dramatically. Between 2017 and 22, which are the two ag census periods, we lost 7% of all farms. But that, kind of averaging out everything is kind of misleading because the smallest farms dropped by 18%, whereas the very largest farms increased by 65%. So again, this drive toward consolidation. Land and farms also dropped about 27%, which just as a reference point is about twice the size of Texas. And in terms of acreage, the only size class that increased was farms operating on 5,000 acres or more. Again, pointing to this rapid increase of consolidation of both land and wealth. These trends are affecting the Mid-Atlantic, maybe not as severely as say the Midwest and some of the other regions, and there are some variations. But overall, you still see the same trend of, a loss of small farms, more large farms, and more consolidation, just not quite as extreme. Maryland and New Jersey had a slight uptick in very small and beginning farms, so, maybe that's a good sign. But land and farms is down over 1 million acres, and that affects all of the Mid-Atlantic states. Most of those losses occurred within permanent pasture and woodland, probably due to stress in the local dairy sector. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. But the loss of the land in farms, that data in the census doesn't tell us what happened to the land. That said, because we haven't updated our farms under threat mapping to this period yet either, but I think, looking at the trends that are happening in the region, we can expect that a lot of that loss went into development. So now, on this happy note, right, the economic headwinds right now are affecting all scales of agriculture. Recent federal policies have really thrown it all into kind of a state of chaos. So this year, farmers are facing a double squeeze, and the year is especially tough. There's been a sharp rise in key input costs in the early part of this year. It was partly due to tariffs. Some of that is kind of getting worked out, but now there's the war in Iran and the closing of the Gulf of Hormuz. So input costs are way up, like fuel prices are up almost 50%. Fertilizer prices are up. All these spikes hit during planting. And at the same time, the prices farmers are receiving for their products, if you take beef out of the equation, but most farmers have not kept up with this kind of inflation or even gone down. And as a result, you see growing financial distress, especially for small farms. So Chapter 12, farm bankruptcies rose in 2025. In April, we saw a 130% jump from a year ago and 82% higher than the Chapter 12 filings in March of 2026. That's really dramatic. And these were small farms that are getting squeezed out and don't qualify for federal farm support. But they're also the operations that tend to anchor local economies and civic life, especially in rural communities. And I think what really disturbs me most is these figures really underestimate the problem because many farmers struggling close, consolidate, or exit without ever filing. If you report a lot of off-farm income, you probably can't even qualify for Chapter 12. As the farm economy weakens, we see development pressures accelerating. So usually if the farm economy weakens, land prices go down, but there's so much new pressure right now that isn't happening. They're staying really elevated. Competition for land is fiercer than ever, and we're really seeing this in the Mid-Atlantic, especially Virginia is seeing a lot of data center development. Pennsylvania has a lot of warehouse development. All the states are dealing with utility solar arrays. There are just a lot of now industrial pressures on rural lands, along with, the sort of historical conversion of land to urbanization and large lot residential development. This is consuming, thousands of acres of productive land. It often starts near urban fringes, but it's really spreading out into rural communities. And as a result, what we've seen in the last 5 years is that all land values have surged. Last year, the national average for farm real estate reached an all-time high, but cropland values in particular have had a dramatic increase, climbing from up about 42% over the 5-year period, and that's adjusted for inflation. The growth wasn't uniform. It varied widely depending on land quality and region. But you can see in the map in red and in sort of the darker orange colors, some mid-Atlantic states were hit especially hard, losing as much as 8,000 or more acres. All were at least in shades of orange. None were in light yellow of 2,600 acres or less. And that's really important because, the states in the region tend to be geographically smaller than some states like the Dakotas or Texas or something. And so losing that much of the land is really dramatic. And supply remains super tight. USDA released its 10-year ownership and transition of ag land survey in March, and reported that only about 2% of land all across the country is expected to be sold to a non-relative in the sort of foreseeable future, which is leaving very, very little farmland available on the open market. Landowners increasingly see farmland as a safe haven asset during geopolitical instability, like the war in Iran. So they're holding on to their acreage. When the farmland does hit the market, especially if you're in an adjacent operation, competition is super intense. So large farmers with strong equity can pay a premium to protect their legacy and expand their footprint, even if their profit margins are tightening. So again, this is leading to consolidation so that 2% of the largest farms with 5,000 acres or more controlled 42% of the nation's farmland. And conversely, those small farms with less than 50 acres only controlled about 2%. So this is really sort of driving us into, I think of it as an existential threat. We really depend on small farms to grow. We really want to give access to a new generation of farmers to enter agriculture and succeed. And all these factors, development pressure, consolidation, institutional investors I forgot to mention, institutional investors who have really come in strong in the last 5 years, and while Farmers still account for about 75% of all buyers at land auctions. There's an increasing presence of institutional capital that's keeping up that floor for land prices, often citing global food security and land scarcity. They're publicly traded farmland real estate investment trusts or REITs, and they've been a key driver of this capital influx. But Wall Street and other institutional investors have joined them, seeing farmland as a stable asset class and a hedge against inflation. So once this was a niche in their portfolios, they're now buying farmland at high prices, and their assets are now valued at over $16 billion, nearly twice their pre-pandemic footprint at the end of 2024. So all of these things together have really disrupted land markets. And so that land access is a growing crisis, especially for a next generation and small and historically underserved producers. So with all that, I know this maybe sounds like a kind of bleak picture, and I've lost sleep over it, I have to say, but I am a believer in radical hope, and it's going to take courage and commitment, but I really believe that we can transform our food systems to be more sustainable, resilient, and fair, and I think there's a huge amount of public support for that. So if you're taking anything away from this presentation, I really hope that it'll be that collectively we have the power to bring about change. We're not going to be able to rely on the federal government, probably can't rely on the private marketplace to help small farmers or to ensure community food security. But with foresight and planning and with collective action, there's a lot we can do at the state and the local levels to support small farms and ensure a sustainable and resilient food system. So, given all the things that planners work on and do, and, we have an affordable housing crisis, transportation issues, all of those things, why should you care about small farm survival? And I think, the first reason is that the benefits of small farms ripple far beyond the individual farm families and sustain communities, right? Small farms are more likely to be diversified, and that's more sustainable, better for the environment. Small and mid-sized farms produce much of the food we eat, especially poultry and specialty crops like fruits, vegetables, and nuts. If you're not familiar with USDA language, those are specialty crops. They supply local and regional markets, supporting community food security. And as we learned through COVID, this builds resilience, buffering communities from supply chain disruptions when production is concentrated in fewer systems and markets. And they anchor local economies. Large farms often rely on distant or automated supply chains, creating economic leakage when land consolidates into large operations that purchase inputs from national or global suppliers rather than buying things locally or regionally. On the other hand, small farms buy supplies, machinery, services from the region. This spending recirculates within communities, creating what's called a multiplier effect, supporting local jobs and businesses. When they go out of business, other businesses lose customers, often leading to secondary closures, and the entire ag industry declines. There are lots of studies that show that regions dominated by fewer, larger farms tend to have lower employment per acre, weaker local economic multipliers than regions with many small and mid-sized farms, which is most of what we have in the Mid-Atlantic region. So let's hold on to them. And then finally, counties with high farm consolidation experience faster population decline, fewer wage jobs, and more diversified farming regions. And as these young and working age residents move away to find work and opportunity, rural communities are hollowed out, losing social infrastructure like schools and hospitals and community vitality. So again, I've sort of talked about what I have seen as kind of a change in public sentiment since COVID, when people sort of realized they couldn't necessarily take the food supply they were used to for granted. And I think because we realized we were really unprepared, that our systems weren't as resilient as we once thought. not just for the supply chain disruptions, but even for that sudden surge in home cooking. Um, so even though this exposed sort of the vulnerability of our dominant food systems, I think it also really pointed to opportunities for innovation and change. Because what we learned is that places that had established local and regional food systems pivoted quickly and could fill gaps and leverage community networks to meet production, processing, and marketing needs. There was this huge amount of sort of community togetherness and trying to find solutions within the community to respond to these threats. We found that local and regional food systems were quick to react, to adapt, to innovate, like within weeks, setting up online ordering, right? Filling gaps in food supply chains at home and abroad. So we can learn from and build on this experience, but it'll take planning at the local, regional, and state levels. It'll take policy from local to state, even to federal. And it'll take both public and private investment in middle infrastructure to support the marketing and distribution needs of smaller operations. So I've been doing a lot of work around sort of what is food system planning, not only in the US, but sort of looking at some of the global interest in this. And I've come across like a whole series of shared principles related to food system planning and development. And they point to what I think are a shared set of guiding principles that I follow and I think are really important to follow. And they include diversity in scale and size and geography and practices and people and preferences and culture. It's health, individual, community, and ecological health. It's access to food, to land, and to other essential food system resources. And it's transparency and fair treatment throughout the supply chain. And within that, I think, at least in my experience with planning, I've used like two common approaches, right? And because I work a lot in rural communities, I found that the planning process and the action steps that come out of it can be as important as the actual plan. Now, this may not be as true if you're doing a comp plan or a hazard mitigation plan, but in sort of food system planning and in planning for ag, I really think that the process of bringing people together and identifying opportunities, needs and opportunities is really important. And for years, I took a problem-solving approach. But what I found, and maybe this is because farmers complain a lot, but what I found was that for every problem, we discovered another problem, and that led to another problem and another until we all felt discouraged by all the things that we couldn't solve and that stood in our way. And so I began to feel like this was sort of a Chicken Little approach. Over the past decade or so, I've switched to an asset-based approach. So it's more maybe of a community development kind of approach. And I call it the little engine that could. But I found that when I bring diverse groups together who have a shared interest in local farms and food, people come up with really creative solutions to seemingly intractable problems. So my new mantra is, let's find at least one good reason why it can be done. And I found that this can really energize people and come up with some really great solutions. So in that, again, when I was in planning school, we sort of used a linear kind of system for a planning process, and I find it's more iterative and spiraling. And so I sort of created this version. This is a planning audience. There's nothing especially unique about food system planning process. It involves assessing trends and conditions by collecting reliable data, visioning, goal setting, mapping, developing recommendations, vetting, all of that. But what I found, again, sort of emphasizing work with farmers and rural communities, is that it's really important not to just do a survey at the beginning of the process and call that community engagement, but to really actively engage the community early, often throughout the process in a very inclusive way, including farmers and not just their gatekeepers like Farm Bureau or Cooperative Extension, who are important, yes, but not just them. but the diverse range of farmers in the community, including small farmers who often get left out of the process. I was working in Ohio in a county, and there was a very large plain set community. And in their comp plan, they had a whole section on supporting agriculture. But in that, it was only really based on Farm Bureau and what the English farmers wanted. And it had not engaged the Amish and the Mennonite farmers at all in the process. And so they had a huge gap in what they were recommending should occur. And so we went through a process, engaged everybody, and what the Amish and the English all found was that they had more in common than what held them apart. Um, in that also, and I'll get to this a little bit more in the next slide, is to focus on assets, not deficits. Rural communities usually are defined by their deficit, right? The lack of population, rather than the things that they have that they can use to move food system planning forward. And then to move for achievable outcomes. So not have a laundry list of 50 recommendations, but really a few really actionable things then come out of the planning process. Farmers really want to see change happen, and they don't want a plan that's going to sit on a shelf collecting dust. And then with that, it's also to tailor strategies to specific conditions and needs. I was working in a very rural county in New Mexico, and they had very small, like 25,000 people on 3,200 square miles, so a lot of land, very low wealth, lots of federal land, and very limited water resources, like one aquifer. The community really wanted to support its local farms. They had pecans, they had a lot of peppers, they had some wineries. And they have to update their comp plans every 5 years. So the planner they hired wanted to support agriculture because they were asked to support agriculture. And what they recommended was a purchase of development rights program. Clearly, it was the only tool they knew that was related to agriculture. But given the amount of land available, the lack of public money, fierce competition for water rights, it was absolutely the wrong tool to recommend. So it's really important to take those conditions in the community to heart when you're thinking of what strategies could help small farms and community food systems. So as I mentioned before, I prefer an asset-based approach. I especially like the community capitals framework. It was developed by Cornelia Butler Flora for use in rural community development. And I found it a really useful tool in food system planning and in planning for agriculture in rural and other communities, especially those with limited financial capital. So community capitals or assets are any type of resource that can be invested, used, or saved to build community wealth. Leveraging them creates opportunities to respond to food systems needs. So just to unpack this a little bit, beyond financial capital like banks or CDCs or CDFIs, they include built capital, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, like buildings and roads and bridges and supporting infrastructure like public water and sewage, those kinds of things, but also natural capital that rural communities tend to be very rich in, right? And that's a whole range of ecosystem services, from farmland and high quality soils to water resources to wildlife habitat, biodiversity. There's social capital, which I sort of hate that term because it really just means relationships between people. But that includes bonding activities between people who are close to each other, and lots of rural communities are closely bonded, but bridging activities between people and groups who are not closely tied, and linkages to harness relationships from outside the community to support local vision, goals, and activities. And then there are things like human capital, workforce development, education and training, community institutions like healthcare, childcare, and schools. There's cultural capital, including shared beliefs, values, tastes, and preferences. It can be reflected in food, in language, and customs. And it can be like fairs and festivals and that kind of thing. And then finally, political capital, and not only referring to people who are in positions of power, but also to access to power and the ability to influence decision making. So that could be something like creating an ag board to support local farmers having a voice in community decisions. And then kind of getting on to the actions that communities can take. And I'm going to take a pretty high level view of this. But the main thing is to really look at what's in your zoning and your other local ordinances and make sure that they're really thinking of the needs of small farms and community food systems. So that can be everything from, ancillary and accessory uses, like, allowing hunting on farms. It can be accessory uses like having a farm stand or allowing for composting of municipal leaves. It requires really clear rules to govern public health and safety. If you want to allow things like agritourism, wineries, breweries, distilleries, it can mean investing in infrastructure and markets to serve producers and consumers and permitting value-added processing on the farm or in shared use facilities to increase the retail value of farm products. But overall, it's creating, a helpful regulatory framework that not only protects public health and safety, but also really promotes and supports small farms and businesses that can increase community food security. I think that piece of middle infrastructure is really important. As I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of the processing, and it's also true in retailing, in the sort of big ag industries has become incredibly concentrated, and we've lost a lot of that middle infrastructure in between. And so it's really going to take ramping up planning, policy, and both public and private investment to link producers with consumers through direct marketing channels like farmers markets, farm stands, CSAs, intermediated farm markets like farm to school and other public institutions, food hubs, that aggregate and cool and store and pack local and regional products. And working with cooperative extension, who can be a great ally in local planning efforts to advance marketing alternatives, right? So not only looking at sort of big markets, but actually really developing some specialty markets and niche markets to support the smaller farms in your community. We need to give small and mid-sized producers many more market alternatives that are scaled appropriately and oriented towards communities instead of towards shareholders of multinational corporations. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't encourage you to keep farmland in farming, and maybe to make more land available for farming, not just as like, an element in an open space plan, an open space plan or an element or a piece of the open space element in a comp plan, but opening doors to land access, especially to young, small, beginning, and historically underserved producers, who are getting squeezed out of markets. And that could be by leasing public land. Boulder, Colorado has a great program of leasing 25,000 acres now, albeit it's a big Western state, but still leasing land to encourage local food production, right? It could be land link programs, giving tax incentives to retiring farmers to encourage them to lease land to small farmers. It's retaining land in agriculture through regulatory tools like zoning, but making sure that zoning really says that ag is preferred in certain districts. So it's not just rural residential, but it's actually agricultural zoning. There are mitigation tools to use if somebody comes in and develops a lot of farmland, to require them then to invest in protecting farmland somewhere else. And incentives like current use assessment, right? Taxing farmland at its value for agriculture, not its potential value for development, and permanently protecting farmland by purchasing or transferring development rights. So there are a lot of tools that planners often are are familiar with, and some maybe not as familiar with. And then finally, because we want our systems to be environmentally as well as economically sustainable and resilient and adapting, able to adapt to and even mitigate against climate change, it's really important to think about resource conservation as part of the whole package. There's not as much you can do at the local level. Most environmental laws are at the state or federal levels, but there still are ways planners can help farmers protect their natural resources. And that could be, everything I've mentioned on farm composting before, but that's a great way to return nutrients to the soil. It can be allowing farmers to generate electricity through appropriately placed solar installations or methane digesters. And it can even be, providing support. Maybe there could be a person in the community who actually helps navigate the complex web of environmental regulations. Um, Most importantly, and often I find that planners aren't familiar with conservation, soil and water conservation districts. Um, it's really great to enlist your local conservation district staff in planning activities. It's part of their charter, and they can be an incredibly important ally in those efforts. And so with that, rather than going into a whole lot more research on any individual tool, I thought I could just sort of point you towards a bunch of resources because, each state in the region is going to have kind of a different mix of things that you can do. So the first resource that I'm very happy to talk about is that last fall we released a Planning for Ag Toolkit in Virginia, which is free and open access on AFT's Farmland Information Center website. So I hope you can check it out and maybe even consider doing something similar in other states in the region. Um, there's also a really great website that is still being maintained by the University of Buffalo. It came out of a project that we were involved with UB and the Ohio State University. Our goal in that project was to build local government capacity to enhance community food security while ensuring sustainable and economically viable ag and food production. We did wrap up it was a USDA funded project that we wrapped up several years ago. But UB is still really active in the space and maintaining the website, which has lots of resources from research to case studies of innovative communities to lessons learned from 8 communities, which we call Communities of Opportunity, that I was working in, where we provided extensive technical assistance. There's also a new tool that I had a little bit to do with called Carrot, the Community and Ag Resilience Audit Tool, which is a free open source resource for communities to assess their local food systems assets to advance community resilience. It has 101 indicators to measure resources within a food system and to determine the next steps for enhancing community resiliency and food sovereignty. We've developed a bunch at AFT, we've developed a bunch of is your community food friendly or farm friendly checklists. We tend to adapt them for the different places where we work. And I would encourage people to adapt them for their own communities as well. But they are also available for free on our information center site. And with that, thank you. If you haven't had enough of me already, I do have a book out on planning for sustainable and resilient food systems. It covers a lot of what I've talked about today, but the second half of the book is really a toolbox with lots of examples of how different communities across the country have used state and local policies to strengthen ag and their food systems. It's available through the publisher, which is Routledge, but also on sites like Amazon and even on Walmart, apparently. I don't know. But with that, thank you very much for your time and attention. And I hope that you're still with me and maybe you have some questions.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was a great presentation. Thank you for laying out the issues and providing these resources. We have had a couple questions come in. First off, we've got a question from Joe Gorney. And as I prepare to read this question, I'll just remind folks, feel free to throw your questions in the Q&A box. So Joe asks, how much soil is lost through typical chemical-based agriculture? What does chemical-based agriculture do to the nutritional value of food and the health of the soil?
That is a huge question. Um, and I certainly don't have an answer to the first one. I think you would have to look at the type of crop, there are a lot of practices and so on. But what we do see is that sort of the way kind of more, I guess we could now call it traditional, but sort of, the more industrial kind of agricultural practices, do cause water pollution. They do compact soils and so on. So people are really turning to low till and no till systems um, to 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 create more soil health. So if you want to send me that question, I could give you a better answer and send you to some resources because again, it really does depend on the type of crop, the type of conditions of the soil. And the second half of it was affecting nutritional quality. Is that true? So again, there have been lots of contradictory studies on this. There's some folks at John Hopkins, the Center for Livable Futures, that have done some work in this, looking at how organic agriculture actually can have, you know, because the soil health has higher quality, I believe that that also can give the food higher quality. So there are some studies that have been done that show that sort of as soil health declines, so does the nutritional value of food. But this is, pretty much out of my element. So, again, if you want to send me the question, I can give you some resources to investigate it further.
Thanks, Julia. I flagged it and I will make sure that's sent over to you. Um, see a couple questions coming in. I have one, if folks don't mind, we do have a bit of time. So I noticed that you had flagged during the presentation, you had mentioned the need for infrastructure, like for supporting infrastructure, for example, and the distribution centers. Can you speak to, what planners can do, or maybe just expand upon that and what's the most ideal and what those processes look like?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things planners can bring to the table is good research. Um, so one of the things we hear a lot, and I mentioned before, sort of the consolidation and meat packing, right? And so a lot of people, this is certainly true in my region. I'm in New England. Is they'll say we need more processing for livestock, right? So we need more meat packing facilities. I think it's really important to really assess the demand for that. So the Vermont Jobs Fund has done a lot of really good economic research on this, and they looked into the need for more processing capacity. And what they found was, yes, there was some need for processing capacity, and planners, especially if you can work regionally and think of where to place things, that's important. But they also found that part of it was the way the farmers were using that capacity. So it was coming in all at once. So they'd have this rush on the need to slaughter and pack, and then there would be nothing later. And so it also was important to work with the farming community to spread out when they were going to the facilities, as well as to figure out where to put the facilities. But all of those things together, so looking at sort of the demand side, the supply side, and then figuring out how to find that common ground so that you actually are investing in it and then working with communities to allow those kinds of things to occur. I think it's easier when you're looking at sort of fruit and vegetable production, again, to get into, say, Whole Foods or something like that, they want a certain amount of volume, right? And they want a reliable, sort of steady supply. And so if you can figure out infrastructure to help, cool store and pack and get stuff ready, maybe even working with labeling, creating a brand that people can do. There was a long time that state departments of ag were doing, like mass grown and fresher. I think being more specific than that is probably good. But finding ways to differentiate the product and then making sure that you can get it into some of the larger retailers, so that farmers aren't only relying on selling things, from a roadside stand or in a farmer's market, but can get into larger markets. I think that's that middle piece that we really need to build out. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it certainly does help. Thank you. And we have a question from Janice Ashley next. Janice asks, and apologies if I'm getting any name pronunciations wrong. Janice asks, in general, what have you found are the greatest local zoning or regulation barriers to helping promote small farms or sustainable food systems?
Mm. That's a great question. I think one of the biggest ones, and this is sort of on the land use side, is that so many communities have kind of rural residential ag all wrapped into one in zoning. And so that just leads to lots of nuisance complaints. It fragments the landscape into kind of large lot development, instead of smart growth where you're, developing closer to infrastructure and then leaving larger swaths of land available for farming or forestry, whatever. So I think that's one thing, is really looking at sort of the land use zones and making sure that you have zones that say ag is a preferred land use in certain zones where it makes sense. I also think really there are lots of conflicts that happen when farmers try to add value to their products on the farm. That could be just turning their berries into jams and jellies, but making sure that the public health laws are appropriate for the scale, and not saying, well, if you're Welch's, you have to do this, but if you're a small farmer, you still have to do the same thing and have the same kind of capacity as if you were a big, kind of an industry person in it. So I think really looking at those things, what are you allowing on the farms? Again, making sure that you're protecting the community as well, but what do you allow? Do you allow local dairies to process their own milk? Like that's been a big change around where I am, where some dairies are now bottling their own milk and doing home delivery, but certain towns had to change their zoning to allow that. So I think the combination of looking at land use policies, but also looking at sort of the economic incentives that you're allowing, so that farmers can diversify and add value to raw products is really important.
Thank you, Julia. Let me go up. I think I had seen a question come in a little bit earlier, when you were speaking to the influence of, or just the impacts from federal changes. All right, let's see. Can you speak to the financial policies at the federal level that incentivize consolidation and institutional investors? This seems to be an issue across many sectors.
Yeah, I think I'll separate the two. So the policy, and I originally had more on federal farm policy, and then I just decided that it was just too much. But federal policy rewards base acreage, production. So the more land you have, the more you produce, the more money you get. So again, that is driving consolidation, so that you find that the richest farmers who probably need support less are getting more, whereas the smaller farmers who need support more are getting nothing. Um, it looks like about 80% of federal farm payments go to the top 10% of farms. So, not to say that, if you're in the Midwest, and your soybean market has been destroyed by federal policy, we shouldn't do something to help those guys out. I don't oppose that, but I think that the way we look at these issues and the way we value the role of small and mid-sized farms in our communities is really disproportionate in federal policy. And in terms of the institutional investors, um, that is a new niche, and I am desperate to do some good research on this. 5 years ago, we sort of said, yeah, I wonder if we should worry about this. but it was such a small percent that it didn't seem to matter. This influx into capital since COVID has been astonishing. And I don't know what we're going to do about that and whether that's a state level response or it's a federal level response. It's something that we're talking about internally. Um, but I do worry a little bit because one of those big ones, Acre Trading, one of the early investors in that is our vice president. So I do think that maybe behind the scenes, there's some stuff going on that I'm not as aware of, but maybe I'm just being paranoid. I don't know. But certainly federal farm policy since the 70s has really been driving for, productivity, specialization, efficiency, which, again, hasn't been great environmentally and has really driven this consolidation.
Thank you for taking that question. Juanetta Millette, again, apologies with the pronunciation, if there's any errors, asks any movement on the Black Farmers Bill? What's the future of equitable outcomes?
Oh, that is a sore subject. No, there's been a backlash against that kind of thing, and so we have all been, um, all of us who take federal money are being audited and looked at. There's a long list of banned words, including the word black. So we're all trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that there has been, um, something that the current administration wants to deny, but a very active process of driving certain populations, especially Black farmers and especially Black farmers in the South, off of their land, and taking that land. Um, but right now you can't, like, you get sued if you even talk about it. So people are trying to find other ways. We have been really advocating for a small farms office. A small farm office would encompass, all of our underserved producers because they all fall into that smaller category. And it would pick up, beginning farmers as well. And so I think taking a big tent approach is going to be more effective in this political environment. And I really hope we can move that forward.
Thank you. Um, let's see. I don't see any other questions queued. I had folks, feel free to continue to drop those. We do have some time. A question that I had, you'd spoken a little bit about the obstacles. Are there any, zoning success stories or successful zoning strategies, especially when it comes to, continued development and preserving um, good farmland?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that examples, you can look at, say, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, right? They've done a lot, not only with permanent farmland protection, but also with using zoning effectively. I think that, and lots of other counties across the region. You can look at Montgomery County, which created an ag preserve using zoning and transfer of development rights and has secured 50,000 acres, right? So I think that the main lesson in the zoning is to make sure if you're looking at land use zoning, that ag is the preferred land use. And so that any competing uses are, discouraged, rather than encouraged in those districts. Um, yeah.
Thanks, Julia. I do not see any other questions at this time. I'm not sure if you have any final remarks that you'd like to make before I sort of close us out. And if a question comes in, we can absolutely take it.
Sure. I mean, I guess I'm always curious. I always find webinars bizarre because I can't see the people, I just see the number. Um, And so I don't really know who's out there, but I wonder if anybody has a good example from your region of something that you have done that you thought was really effective that I could learn from or that we all could learn from.
And so, folks, if you want to just throw those in the chat, I know, I mean, in brief format, that would be great.
You can
Or
say,
if you,
look up this,
or if
right?
you'd like to raise your hand, I can absolutely unmute you if you'd like to speak to it as well. And maybe just to give some folks some time to put those examples in the chat if they have them, I will just do some of the housekeeping reminders as we close out. Again, all the slides will be provided to all attendees in the follow-up e-blast, excuse me, and that will also include the link to the recording. And Julia is happy to be a resource, and her email will be included in that. And her email's on the screen right here as well. I'll also put it in the chat. Um, Stay tuned for the next webinar in the series. You may have noticed, have shifted this year to the second Thursday scheduling, so it's easy date to remember. And I'll just do a quick plug for APA Virginia's conference in July in Danville. Early bird registration ends in 4 weeks, so take advantage of those early bird rates. But thank you so much. Oh, it looks like a question has popped up. Janice Ashley notes that her local government, City of Asheville, North Carolina, connects city employees with local CSA and allows payment through payroll deductions. Really easy way to connect to community farming.
That's an awesome example. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Janice, very much.
I didn't know we reached all the way to North Carolina.
And another one has just popped up. Sherry Atkin says, or this may be a question, excuse me. Sherry asks, do you see opportunity with promoting co-location of solar farms and agriculture to address the concerns you outlined in your presentation?
Yeah, so I think agrivoltaics, it's called, or dual use or co-locating, can be a great solution. We promote what we call smart solar, which is sort of like building on, smart growth principles within solar development. So really looking at how you can integrate even, a community scale, where you're selling solar to the grid, not just supporting the farm operation with renewable energy, but selling to the grid, by, raising the poles so that you could graze livestock underneath. There have been some studies that show that you can grow certain vegetables underneath, and it keeps soil moisture, or maybe it keeps the heat off of, say, lettuce and things like that. So people are doing a lot of experimenting with it, and I think it's a really important area to look into, and to make sure that when you encourage agrivoltaics or dual use on the farm, that you're looking at both the needs of the energy companies, and at the needs of the farmer. But yeah, I think that there's a lot that you can do. And when we send out resources, we can add a link to some of our resources on that. Because we've been doing a lot of work on that in the last 5 years. Yeah, I think that's a great
That
question.
would be great. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate everyone being on for this month's webinar in the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration webinar series. And thank you so much to Julia for her expertise and for her passion. Um, Thank you, and we'll be in touch.